The dust knows no morality. It is the great equalizer, the final blanket for sinner and saint alike. It rises from the parched earth not with malice, but with an indifferent sigh, a reminder that all things, in time, return to grit and silence. It chokes the lungs of the righteous man and the condemned man with the same impartial grit. On this day, under a sun that burned like the eye of a vengeful God, the dust of Redemption Gulch was a witness. It Sir Elias Thorne, a man already buried in a grave of his own making, being given a second burial by the hands of his neighbors. The rope was coarse against the raw skin of his wrists, a serpent of judgment tied to the saddle horn of a horse that trotted with a lazy, unconcerned rhythm. Elias didn't fight. He had forgotten how. The will to resist had been burned out of him years ago, leaving behind only the hollowed-out shell of a man, a walking testament to the consuming power of grief and shame. His face, once carved with the hard lines of a frontiersman, was now a mask of acceptance, dragged through the filth and gravel of the town's only street. Each stone that ripped at his back, each cloud of alkali dust that filled his mouth, was a penance he felt he had long since earned. He remembered the fire. He always remembered the fire. It flickered behind his eyelids, an eternal flame consuming the faces of his wife, his son. The smell of smoke was a ghost that lived in his nostrils. They said a lantern tipped. They said it was an accident. But in the hollow chambers of his heart, he knew the truth, he had not been there. He had been in town, drinking away a phantom sorrow, and had returned to a different kind of phantom, the skeletal frame of his home, silhouetted against a dawn sky thick with ash. The town had pitied him, then, for a time. But pity curdles when a man's grief becomes a mirror for their own discomfort. His silence became unnerving, his isolation a judgment. He became the town's scar, a reminder of fragility they could not abide. So they rewrote the story. The accident became negligence. The grieving husband became a pariah. A brand on his hand, delivered by a posse of self-appointed judges one moonless night, sealed his fate. Now, this. A horse theft he didn't commit was the excuse, the flimsy nail upon which they hung their years of festering resentment. Preacher Silas stood on the boardwalk, his Bible held aloft like a weapon. His voice, slick with sanctimony, coated the scene in a veneer of divine justice. Behold the wages of sin. The Lord works through the hands of the righteous to cleanse this land of its blight. The crowd murmured its assent, their faces a collection of hard satisfaction. This was entertainment. This was a ritual. By punishing the outcast, they affirmed their own fragile place within the fold. Sheriff Brody watched from the shade of his office, his arms crossed, his face a grimace of conflicted duty. He knew Elias was no horse thief. He knew this was mob rule masquerading as frontier justice. But the tide of public opinion was a powerful current, and Brody had never been a strong swimmer. He was a man who policed by consensus, and the consensus was clear. So he let the dust have him. He let the rope bite. He let the hooves fall. Elias closed his eyes, welcoming the darkness, the grit, the final, grinding erasure. He was already a ghost. This was just the ceremony. The world was a muffled roar of hooves and condemnation, a slow, percussive journey toward an oblivion he no longer feared. The sun beat down, indifferent. The dust rose, impartial. And the man who had lost everything was dragged toward nothing. The procession of cruelty was a slow, deliberate thing, a wound being carved into the landscape. The horse, a creature of simple obedience, followed the command of its rider, a lanky ranch hand named Jeb, whose face was alight with the dull, cruel pleasure of holding power over a broken man. The townspeople followed at a distance, a shuffling Greek chorus of whispers and pointed fingers. They had come to the edge of town, where the single dusty street bled into the vast, unforgiving plains. This was the liminal space between civilization and wilderness, and it was here they meant to leave their mark, to cast out their scapegoat and return to their orderly lives, cleansed. And it was here that the procession stopped. Not with a command. Not with a gunshot. It stopped because a figure had appeared in the road, as if summoned from the heat shimmer itself. She was small, a willow switch of a girl, her black trousers and tunic the simple, practical attire of the Chinese laborers who toiled on the railroad tracks miles away, a community as isolated and reviled as Elias himself. Her name was Mai. She carried a small, empty basket on her way back from gathering herbs by the creek bed. She simply stood there. She did not raise her voice. Her hands were empty. Her face, a mask of calm impassivity, held no overt challenge, yet her presence was a rock in the stream, forcing the current of hatred to part around her. Jeb pulled back on the reins, the horse snorting in confusion. "Get out of the road, girl," he spat, the words heavy with contempt. Mai did not move. Her gaze was not on him. It was on the rope and on the still form of the man it held captive in the dust. Her eyes, dark and deep as a well, took in the bloody furrows on his back, the matted dirt in his hair, the quiet surrender in his posture. Preacher Silas marched forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Heathen! You dare interfere with the Lord's work? This man is a sinner, condemned by God and community. Step aside." He brandished his book as if to ward off a demon. Mai's gaze lifted from Elias and settled on the preacher. There was no fear in her eyes. There was no anger. There was only a profound, unshakable stillness. It was a silence that spoke louder than the preacher's booming condemnations. It asked a question without uttering a sound: what kind of God demands this? Sheriff Brody sighed, pushing himself off the wall of his office porch and striding toward the impasse. This was not how this was supposed to go. This was supposed to be a quick, ugly, and final affair. He began, his voice attempting a tone of authority that felt hollow even to him. "You need to move along. This is town business." She turned her head slightly to acknowledge him, a small, bird-like movement. But she did not step aside. Her feet seemed to have grown roots into the hard-packed earth. The crowd grew restless. The certainty of their righteous anger began to fray. Her defiance wasn't loud or aggressive, it was quiet, absolute, and utterly foreign. They knew how to handle a man who fought back. They did not know what to do with a small girl who simply stood. Jeb, frustrated, tried to steer his horse around her. As the horse moved, Mai moved with it, a small, silent step, placing herself back in its path. She was a ghost, a shadow he could not shake. He cursed, pulling the horse to a halt again. The spectacle was ruined. The raw, primal satisfaction was gone, replaced by a strange and uncomfortable tension. A man in the crowd laughed, a short, nervous bark. The spell was broken. The cruelty, when examined under the patient gaze of this silent girl, suddenly looked less like justice and more like what it was: a pathetic, cowardly act. Jeb threw the rope to the ground in disgust. "He ain't worth it," he muttered, wheeling his horse around and riding back toward the saloon. The crowd, robbed of its climax, began to drift away in twos and threes, avoiding each other's eyes, avoiding the still figures in the road. Preacher Silas, sputtering with impotent fury, finally turned and stormed back toward his empty church. Sheriff Brody watched them go, a sour taste in his mouth. He looked at Elias, then at the girl. He tipped his hat, a gesture of grudging, confused respect, and walked away. The dust settled. All that remained was the silence, the vast sky, and two outcasts alone in the road. Elias slowly, painfully, pushed himself onto his hands and knees. He coughed, a dry, rattling sound, spitting dirt from his mouth. He expected her to leave. Everyone always left. But she was still there. She knelt, not too close, and unslung a small water skin from her shoulder. She didn't speak. She simply held it out. His hand trembled as he reached for it. His fingers, caked in blood and dirt, brushed against hers. He drank, the water a cool blessing on his raw throat. It was the first act of kindness he had known in years. And in that moment, in the shared quiet of the empty road, a single, fragile thread was spun between them. She helped him walk. It was not a grand gesture, but a series of small, supportive motions. Her shoulder, slight as it was, became a crutch for his heavy frame. They moved slowly, a mismatched pair of wounded animals finding their way back to a den. The journey to his dilapidated homestead was a silent pilgrimage. Words were a currency neither of them possessed or required. The language they spoke was in the careful placement of her feet, the slight pressure of her hand on his arm when he stumbled, his own gritted teeth endurance, a silent acknowledgement of her help. His ranch was a portrait of his soul, a broken-down geography of neglect. The fences sagged like tired shoulders. The porch steps groaned in protest. An empty rocking chair, its paint peeling, sat sentinel, a monument to a life that had ended long ago. Inside, the cabin was dark, smelling of stale air and solitude. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light piercing the gloom, illuminating the bare table, the cold hearth, the single cot. This was not a home, it was a holding cell. He collapsed onto the cot, the long day's agony finally claiming him. He expected her to turn and leave, her duty of mercy fulfilled. Instead, she moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose. She took a bucket and went to the well, the creak of the pulley a lonely sound in the afternoon stillness. She returned and, tearing a strip from her own tunic, began to clean the wounds on his back. Her touch was gentle, methodical, impersonal as a healer's. She worked with herbs she pulled from a small pouch at her waist, mashing them into a poultice that smelled of earth and bitter leaves. The sting was sharp, but it was a clean pain, a pain that promised healing, so different from the dull, rotting ache of his shame. He lay there, his face buried in the thin mattress, and endured this strange, unsolicited tenderness. He did not understand it. Kindness was a foreign tongue he had forgotten how to interpret. When she was done, she did not rest. She looked around the cabin, her eyes taking in the decay. She found a broom, its bristles worn to nubs, and began to sweep the floor. The rhythmic scrape of straw on wood was a sound of life in a place that had long been dedicated to death. The simple act of cleaning was a reclamation, a quiet defiance of the despair that had settled like a shroud over everything. He watched her through half-closed eyes. He saw her pick up a fallen book, its spine broken, and place it carefully on the mantel. He saw her straighten a bent tin cup on the table. Small acts. Meaningless, perhaps. Yet, in the profound emptiness of his existence, they felt like cornerstones being laid for something new. That evening, as dusk bled purple and orange across the horizon, she built a fire in the hearth. The crackle and pop of the flames pushed back the shadows, filling the small room with a warm, living light. She had found a small bag of rice and some dried vegetables in her basket and cooked them in a pot over the fire. She served him a bowl. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the scrape of spoons against tin. It was not a meal between strangers, nor one between friends. It was something more elemental. It was two solitary beings sharing warmth and sustenance against the vast, encroaching darkness of the world. He did not know her name. She did not know his. But in the flickering firelight, reflected in the surface of his bowl, he saw not a heathen, not an outsider, but a quiet, formidable strength that had met the world's cruelty and refused to blink. For the first time in years, the fire in the hearth did not remind him of the fire that had taken everything. It felt, instead, like a beginning. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. A new kind of silence settled over the ranch, one that was not empty, but full. It was a silence of shared space, of mutual work, of understanding that flowed not through words, but through actions. Mai rose with the first light, her movements economical and purposeful. She tended to the small patch of barren earth beside the cabin, coaxing stubborn life from the dry soil. She would return with a few hardy greens, a testament to her patience. She mended the fence, not with new wood, but by patiently weaving fallen branches and strips of leather together, creating a patchwork barrier that was less about keeping things out and more about holding what little they had together. Elias watched her, his initial confusion slowly giving way to a reluctant acceptance, which then blossomed into a quiet partnership. The purpose in her hands awakened a long-dormant purpose in his own. He began to work again. He reshod his one remaining horse, the ring of his hammer against the anvil, a sound that had not been heard on this land for years. He repaired the leaking roof of the cabin, his movements sure and steady. He fixed the groaning porch steps. With each nail driven, each board set right, he was not just mending a broken structure, he was mending the broken pieces of himself. They rarely spoke. A nod in the morning. A shared glance over a simple meal. He might hold a fence post steady while she secured it. She might leave a cup of cool water for him on the porch rail while he worked under the sun. These small gestures became their vocabulary, a language far more honest and profound than any words could be. He learned her resilience. He saw the faint scars on her own hands, the calluses from a life of hard labor and little reward. He saw the way she would look toward the distant mountains, her expression unreadable but tinged with a deep, ancestral sorrow. He began to understand that her solitude was as deep as his own, just worn with a different grace. But their quiet world could not remain an island forever. The town of Redemption Gulch watched, and it seethed. Their shared existence was an affront to the town's rigid order. The outcast and the heathen, living together under one roof. It was unnatural, a perversion of the social laws they held sacred. Preacher Silas fanned the flames from his pulpit. He spoke of Sodom and Gomorrah, of the taint spreading from the thorn place, a sickness that had to be cut out before it infected the whole community. His sermons became less about God's love and more about God's wrath, a wrath he seemed eager to direct. The whispers grew into open hostility. Finally, the law arrived. Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch one afternoon, his horse kicking up dust that settled on Mai's new garden. He dismounted, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. "Elias," he said, avoiding the man's eyes. Mai came to stand on the porch, her hand still holding a clutch of weeds. She stood slightly behind Elias, a silent, unwavering presence. Brody gestured vaguely toward her. "This arrangement. It's causing trouble. Folks are talking." The preachers got them all stirred up. Elias remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His silence was no longer one of surrender, it was one of defiance. It was a wall Brody could not breach. The sheriff's frustration grew. He turned his attention to Mai. "You ought to go back to your people. You don't belong here. This ain't your place." Mai met his gaze without flinching. Her stillness was her shield, her silence her strength. She did not need to defend her right to be there, her presence was its own defense. Brody was about to say more, to push, to threaten, when a voice, rough and cracked from disuse, cut through the air. "She stays." The two words were like stones dropped into a still pond. They were the first words Elias Thorne had spoken to another soul in nearly 3 years. They were quiet, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of silence behind them. They were an anchor, a declaration, a line drawn in the dust. Sheriff Brody was stunned into silence. He looked from Elias's hard, determined face to Mai's calm, resolute one. He saw not two broken people, but a fortress. He knew he could not win this argument. He shook his head, a mixture of exasperation and a flicker of something that might have been admiration. "You're making a mistake, Elias," he said, his voice low. "There's gonna be trouble." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving his warning hanging in the air like the dust. Elias did not watch him go. He turned his head and looked at Mai. For the first time, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. She returned it with a slow, solemn nod. The bond had been forged in silence. Now, it had been consecrated with a word. And they both knew the trouble was coming. The trouble came with the fall of night, dressed in righteous fury and carrying fire. A storm had been brewing on the horizon all day, the clouds dark and bruised, mirroring the mood in town. But this storm was man-made. Preacher Silas led them, his face illuminated by the torch he carried, his features twisted into a mask of zealous certainty. Behind him, a mob of 30 men, their faces grim or drunk or merely caught up in the fervor, marched toward the small ranch on the edge of the plains. They were the righteous hand of God, come to purge the land. They were a tide of fear and hatred, come to extinguish a light they could not understand. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. They had seen the torches from a distance, a swarm of angry fireflies moving across the dark prairie. Mai had bolted the door, her movement swift and silent. She placed a heavy iron poker by the hearth. It was not a weapon of hope, but one of last resort. Elias stood in the center of the room, the firelight casting his shadow long and tall against the wall. He was not the same man who had been dragged through the dust. The hollowness in his eyes had been replaced by a hard, protective fire. He was no longer a ghost haunting the ruins of his past. He was a man with something to lose again. He looked at Mai. She stood by the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. There was no panic in her posture, only a deep, collected readiness. In her, he saw not just a companion, but a reflection of the strength he had forgotten he possessed. The home they had built with silent work and shared meals was now a sanctuary under siege. The mob surrounded the small cabin, their shouts a cacophony of slurs and scripture. "Come out, sinner!" Silas bellowed, his voice cracking with fervor. "Face the judgment of the Lord! Bring out the heathen witch!" A rock crashed through the single window, showering the floor with glass. Mai did not flinch. Elias walked to the door. He did not pick up the poker. He did not reach for the old rifle mounted above the mantel. His hands were empty. He slid the bolt back. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, into the flickering, malevolent light of the torches. He stood before them, a solitary figure against the tide. The shouting quieted to a low, hungry murmur. They had expected a coward. They saw a man who was not afraid. "Silas," Elias said, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the night. "There is no judgment here." The preacher took a step forward, his eyes wild. "The judgment is in this fire. The fire of purification. To cleanse you and this land of your unholy union." He gestured toward the cabin, where Mai now stood silhouetted in the doorway. Elias did not turn. He kept his eyes on the preacher, and on the faces of the men behind him. He saw farmers he knew, men whose barns he had helped raise years ago. He saw fear in their eyes, and shame. "Fire," Elias said, the word tasting of ash in his mouth. "You know nothing of fire." He held up his hand, showing them the faded brand seared into his skin. "I have lived in the fire. It takes. It leaves nothing but ghosts." He then gestured back toward the dark shape of the doorway. "That woman, she did not bring fire. She brought water to a man dying of thirst in the dust you left him in. She brought food to a man starving in a home you shunned. You speak of God." His voice grew stronger, filled with a conviction that silenced the mob completely. "You will not find your God in the flame of that torch. I found him in a bowl of rice. I found him in a mended fence. I found him in a quiet kindness that asks for nothing in return." A profound silence fell over the crowd. His words, so rare and hard-won, carried an undeniable truth that cut through their righteous anger. He was not preaching. He was testifying. He was telling them a story of a grace so simple, so profound, it made their torches and their slogans look like the childish tools of bullies. Sheriff Brody, who had followed the mob at a distance, now pushed his way to the front. He looked at the hard, calm face of Elias Thorne. He looked at the fanatical gleam in Preacher Silas's eyes. And he looked at the faces of the townsmen, their certainty wavering, their torches suddenly feeling heavy in their hands. He had made a choice once by doing nothing. He would not make that mistake again. "Silas, it's over," Brody said, his voice firm. "Take these men and go home." The preacher whirled on him. "You would side with the sinner? With the devil's work?" "I'm siding with the law," Brody said, resting his hand on the butt of his pistol. "And the law says this is his home. This is his land. Now, go. Before this fire you're so fond of actually start something none of us can put out." The confrontation was over. The preacher's power, built on fear and rumor, crumbled under the weight of simple, spoken truth. He glared at Elias, his face a mask of hate, but he was defeated. He turned, and the mob, their fervor extinguished, their shame now a cold ember in their guts, followed him back into the darkness, their torches leaving trails of smoke in the night air. The ranch was quiet again, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the newly mended fence. Elias turned and looked at Mai, still standing in the doorway. The fire from the hearth behind her cast a warm, golden halo around her. He walked up the steps and stood before her. No words were needed. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, they both knew they were finally, truly, home. The sun rose, painting the sky in hues of forgiveness. It was the dawn of a new day, not just for them, but for the land itself. For sometimes, redemption doesn't come from a preacher's sermon or a town's forgiveness. Sometimes, it is a quieter thing. It's found in the patient tilling of hard soil. It is built in the silent mending of a broken wall. And it speaks, not in the roar of a mob, but in two simple words spoken after years of pain: she stays. And so a new story was written on that small patch of land. A story not of fire and judgment, but of water and rice. A story not of grand speeches, but of quiet work. The dust still settled, the wind still blew, but they were no longer symbols of erasure and loneliness. They were just the dust and the wind. The life they built was simple, carved out of the space between his resilience and her grace. The town of Redemption Gulch kept its distance, watching from afar, their failed crusade a quiet lesson in the town's memory. Some saw shame, others a mystery, but a few, a very few, saw a kind of truth they had never considered before, that strength is not always loud, and that the most sacred bonds are often the ones forged in the deepest silence. The scars remained. The brand on his hand never fully faded. The memories of the fire and the rope were etched into his soul. But they were no longer the sum of who he was. They were just chapters in a longer story, a story that was still being written, one shared meal, one sunrise at a time. What, then, is the measure of a human soul? Is it found in the congregation on a Sunday morning? Is it written in the laws of a town charter? Or is it found in the lonely, desolate places, where one human being, with nothing to gain, extends a hand to another? Is it not in the grand gestures that we find our salvation, but in the smallest acts of defiant compassion? If you have ever felt like an outcast, branded by a past you cannot escape, if you have ever been left in the dust by a world that does not understand your grief, if you have ever believed yourself to be broken beyond repair, then you must remember this story. You must remember that your redemption will likely not arrive with a clap of thunder or a chorus of angels. It may not come from those who claim to speak for God. Look for it in the quiet places. Look for it in the unexpected corners. It may arrive as a stranger who sees not your scars, but your humanity. It may come as a shared silence that says more than a lifetime of words. It may be nothing more than a simple cup of water, offered at the moment you believe you will die of thirst. Do not lose hope. For true grace is a stubborn, quiet thing, and it often grows best in the hardest soil, tended by the most unlikely hands. Find that hand. Or better yet, be that hand.